Hi, I'm Heather Darch, and this is a presentation by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. In this series called Raising Spirits, we are looking for our vanishing heritage. Change can be a welcome occurrence in the small communities of Quebec's Laurentians, but it can also bring unhappy consequences. Buildings come and go in the name of progress, and usually it's something we take for granted. But we lose something along the way when this happens. We lose traces of how we used to live, what was important, and the art, knowledge, and skills of previous generations. Nowhere is this more evident than when a community loses a valued institution. This is Sainte-Agathe-des-Monts.
My history passion is from very young, and it's still there, and it taught me so much about Les Cantons du Nord and the Eastern Townships as well, but our history. My name is Joseph Graham. I'm a resident of what we call the Cantons du Nord, which is the northern townships. That became the Laurentians, Pays d'En, and so on. Today we are standing on the site of the old Mount Sinai Hospital Tuberculosis Treatment Center. It's gone. The building is gone, as you will see. It was situated at the time in what they called Préfontaine, a part of Sainte-Agathe-des-Monts. And so we're standing technically in the Préfontaine part of Sainte-Agathe-des-Monts, though the name Préfontaine has fallen into disuse. My partner Sheila, Eskenazi, and I, we do virtually everything together. We do the historical research. We also grow our own food. We have a little garden that looks after us. And this particular site brought us together in a way we couldn't have anticipated, because we both were doing the research and discovering how many common roots our families had with this property, even though neither of us had any immediate connection to it. So we can start by talking about tuberculosis. We're standing on the site of Mount Sinai Hospital. If this were 1924 instead of 2024, you wouldn't see me because I would be inside, and you would be outside, that close roughly to the wall. The Mount Sinai Hospital was a sanatorium or a sanitarium. A sanatorium, the word defines a dry place in the mountains for a military encampment. And the word came down as sanatorium or sanitarium for places that were dry in the mountains where people could go for what was called the rest cure from tuberculosis. But it's important to start by understanding what tuberculosis was, and why they had to have a rest. Tuberculosis was the greatest enemy modern humanity has faced. It outclasses any military exercise we've ever discussed, much worse than World War II, much worse than any of the plagues. Yet it was constant. Between 1700 and 1900, 1 billion people died of tuberculosis. And it struck people between roughly 18 and 38. It didn't hit, children or elderly the same way. It hit people in the prime of their life. And so that really had an impact on society. The breadwinner, the mother, someone in the family who was very dependent upon suddenly wasn't there. The family would go into a state of poverty, trying to keep things together. And places like Mount Sinai Hospital were created for this rest cure, which was discovered in Germany by a man named Bremer, who contracted tuberculosis. And he was convinced that he was going to die. He was a young man, he was studying botany, he loved botany. He realized his life was over, so he moved. He went to the Himalayas, where he just read about and learned about and examined different botanical plants, made his notes, enjoyed himself to the fullest. It was a rest, but it was also in the dry mountain air. And after a while, he realized that the illness had disappeared. He was no longer sick. He was better. So he went back to Germany, and he went back to school. This is in the 1850s. He became a doctor, and he proposed the thesis of what he called the rest cure. That if you took people out of the pressures of modern life, out of the personal pressures, and gave them dry, cool air, they could overcome the disease. What the function of these sands was to allow people to have this rest cure, which meant they could do little projects, but they had to take it easy. They had to get away from their busy life, and they had to have dry, cool air. So most of them built big verandas outside each floor where they had day beds. And during the day, the people would go out in those beds, no heat. They'd be wrapped in furs and made comfortable. And that was part of the rest cure. Every sand had that. Eventually, those things were closed in as the hospitals needed more beds. But if you look at some of the old hospitals, you can sometimes see these things were built in afterwards. The general day of the doctors and nurses, who are the principal people looking after the patients, there was obviously a lot of staff as well, was basically making them comfortable. They did some experiments with lung collapsing. Dr. Norman Bethune was in this hospital, Mount Sinai, and he was a very hands-on experimenting type of person. And so his name stayed with the place. And would it have stayed any more than any other doctor if he had never gone on to China and Spain and so on? That's an interesting question, but there you go. Also, it's worth noting that you'll hear me say the SAN, which is basically the local short form for the sanatorium. And there's another short form which is in very common use, is instead of saying tuberculosis, especially when you're typing, you write TB in capitals. TB is tuberculosis. Mount Sinai Hospital exists through a coincidence of fascinating circumstances. One aspect was that the Laframboise family farmed here. It was subsistence farming. And they found a buyer, and the buyer happened to be a group of people who felt they could do a commune here. And they were Eastern European immigrants who believed in the commune concept of communism. And they bought it from him, but they had no money. And so they found funding through the Baron de Hirsch Institute in Montreal. Baron de Hirsch would help people, Jewish immigrants particularly, get started in life by finding interest-free loans for them. An interest-free loan allowed them to acquire the property. But every one of us has heard of these communes failing. And they fail because, well, first of all, the Laframboise family could barely feed itself here. A commune wasn't likely to be able to. But also there's these different tensions in that kind of thing. Everyone has a different idea of what it should do and how it should be formulated. And what happened here was that people drifted away until there was too few left. And at that point, they defaulted on their payment of the capital. It turned out that defaulting, the money had come from Mortimer Davis. Sir Mortimer Davis was a major Jewish community philanthropist. He gave 10% of all donations in the Jewish community, which is huge. And he suddenly realized he had to take this property back. He had already bought a place in Sainte-Agathe where he had a lovely country home, a 3-story stone mansion, but a lovely country home. But Mortimer Davis didn't want the property. So he turned it over to a group that wanted to start a tuberculosis treatment center for the Jewish community. And they hired a doctor called Patterson. Dr. Patterson banged a sign in the ground, Mount Sinai Hospital, and they used the house. Mortimer Davis was shocked by the fact that they had no building. He got together with Jacob Jacobs, 2 big philanthropists, and they did a fundraising and they built a hospital for them, which opened officially in 1913. Why they could open that hospital was one of those serendipitous things. Mortimer Davis's neighbor, 2 doors over, was Lorne McGibbon, who had contracted tuberculosis. He was an equal in finance and power to Mortimer Davis, who incidentally owned the Imperial Tobacco Company of Canada, which he actually founded, took his family's cigar store to that. Lorne McGibbon was a rubber baron who is known for his knowledge and his investment in rubber. He contracted tuberculosis. His doctor sent him to Saranac Lake. He was treated, he was cured. He met a doctor from the Eastern Townships there named Dr. Byers. And he said to Dr. Byers, go to Sainte-Agathe, there's 50 acres there that I want you to buy, and we'll do a sand like this in Canada, in Sainte-Agathe. Byers came back to Sainte-Agathe. He cured first. He bought the 50 acres, went to the town with the proposal, and was told categorically that tuberculosis treatment was illegal in Sainte-Agathe. Why it was illegal is that a Dr. Richer had set up one, and it caused so much fear in people that there was tuberculosis. There were spittoons in the street. People were afraid that it would kill everybody. So he couldn't get the permit. When Byers sent this news to McGibbon, who was still getting better, he said, that's just an obstacle. We'll deal with that when I come. And when he came, he asked for a meeting with the town, and he talked to them about Saranac Lake, which is fascinatingly identical to Sainte-Agathe, was then at any rate. Very, very huge number of similarities. But the key point was that he got inspired by what they did there, by Dr. Trudeau. Dr. Trudeau was just like Herman Bremer. He was someone who contracted tuberculosis, went to Saranac Lake basically to die, healed, learned about Bremer, studied all of his work, and set up a stand there. So he knew what he was doing. He cured McGibbon, who came back, told the town how important this would be for Sainte-Agathe, and how he would pay a week's vacation for all of them to go to Saranac Lake and see for themselves. They changed the law. The timing was absolutely fantastic, because whether or not Davis and Jacobs knew or Patterson knew, it allowed them to do it too. Before that, they wouldn't have been allowed. So it worked out very well. One of the government ministers came to the Mount Sinai Hospital in 1927 and interviewed patients. He could find no one who was paying. Everyone was there for free. The foundation paid for it. He was surprised that everyone spoke French, all the patients. There was some non-French, there was Russian, there was other immigrants and so on, but there was a huge French population being served by this public hospital presented by the Jewish community as the Mount Sinai Sanatorium. We can do a comparison of the two sanatoria. You know, there was a lot. There were 6 hospitals that treated tuberculosis. But the two principal ones were the Mount Sinai Hospital and the Laurentian Chest Hospital, both very well respected and known, both with money out of Montreal, one from the English community, one from the Jewish community. Here in 1913, 1914, over to the back of where we are, there was a white building that was a much smaller building, a wood frame building that was the sand that Davis and Jacobs financed the building of. That was the main building until the 1930s, when Goodman and Spence architects were designing the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, and they designed a new building for this site. And it was an Art Deco building. It was very, very attractive. It had a copper dome on the top where they had not a full synagogue, but at least a little place where they could pray. And they had 3 floors, and they still had lots of tuberculosis patients. The old building became the nurses' residence. So the 2 buildings were the center of the Mount Sinai Hospital from there forward. Oh, what kind of things did the patients do? What kind of activities? Well, one is this painting you can see was done by L.J. Boivin, one of the patients, in 1923. And it's a painting of sorrow as he watched one of the other patients slowly dying. He gave the painting to Sheila's great-grandfather. The dedication on the back says, given to Hirsch-Wolofsky by the artist, a patient at Mount Sinai, as a thank you. Another interesting thing that was created at Mount Sinai was a book called The White House, written in Yiddish and translated by Max Rosenfeld into English. The author of the book, Sholem Stern, was considered to be radical, progressive. Maybe that would be the best way of summing him up. And I'll just read a paragraph of the foreword to give you a sense of the book, which is a fairly important piece of Yiddish verse in Canada. The White House is a gallery of unfortunate victims caught in the net of a potentially fatal disease, and at the same time, the love story of one of them. The pervasive color is white, white snow, white beds, white uniforms, white house. The backdrop is a white mountain range. The pervasive emotion is pain, the pain of disease, the anguish of lives disrupted and lost. Sandra Cohen Rose wrote the book of Art Deco, Northern Art Deco, in Montreal, and it included the Mount Sinai. And her description of the building reads as follows. With its buff stucco set off by dark brown metal spandrels and trim, and turquoise glazed tiles, Mount Sinai Sanatorium is reminiscent of Southern Deco and would seem more appropriate surrounded by swaying palm trees rather than gigantic pines. Judaic symbols are found everywhere. A central copper dome houses a chapel with a large stained glass window. On the wall at either side of the chapel window are gold mosaic menorahs, candelabra, with candles of white mosaic set against a background of blue mosaic. Stylized menorahs are also used below the raised portions of the crenellated roofline. Stone bas-relief Stars of David decorate the main entrance, which, like that of the 1932 Montreal Botanical Gardens, steps down to a path leading to an octagonal-shaped pond. My partner, Sheila Eskenazi, and me, we were connected through this place and didn't know it. When we met, I was the farm manager for my uncle, who was the current, at that time, president of the Imperial Tobacco Company of Canada, which had morphed into a holding company called Damasco. Her great-grandfather was one of the major community support people in Montreal for places like Mount Sinai, Baron de Hirsch, and a bunch of other Jewish community institutions. And he was a go-to person for Mortimer Davis. So, and his name was Hirsch Wolofsky. He founded a Yiddish newspaper, and he founded a Yiddish publishing company. And the publishing that he did has given us the third largest body of literature in Canada after French and English. So you can imagine it was an important contribution. That's how Sheila and I were connected, but we only discovered this as we started digging into the history of the Laurentians and discovering that connection through Mount Sinai, because Mortimer Davis was the founder of the Imperial Tobacco Company of Canada. So there's a strong connection, Jewish-Christian connections through the two of us. There was a lot of other connections, and we sort of worried when we opened our office in Sainte-Agathe that there was a lot of heritage buildings that were not being respected. So we created a heritage movement to save the railroad station, and then it went on to save other buildings, to create a walking tour. There was a huge amount of work that was done, and it went on for years. And eventually we discovered that the government that had taken over the Mount Sinai Hospital did no longer want to use it as a long-term care place. They felt it was contaminated with oil in the ground and asbestos, which I suspect is true of a lot of public buildings at that time. And so they decided it should be demolished. We fought like crazy against that demolition. We motivated people to join us, so we learned more and more about the history of it. Well, as you can imagine, I feel a bit of sadness when I come back and look at this site. There's so much of the past that's gone. The building, I felt, was salvageable for some other purpose. But, you know, it's not here, it's gone, we have to just live with that. I'm saddened. I see, you know, the trees that were here at the time, and how many of them have fallen over, and how everything has come to look like a barren field, except things like pieces of metal sticking out of the ground where the building once was. I was really happy, though, to have had the opportunity to work inside of the understanding of the tuberculosis problem in our society, and to realize the scale of it. I mean, this was incredibly informative to me. It affected so much of my thinking about the world generally, that the whole Sainte-Agathe area was there like the lungs for the sick. And in fact, years later, a very wealthy man in Saint-Adèle wanted to see if he could move the whole hospital center to Saint-Adèle from Sainte-Agathe. And I was working with a young lawyer on our heritage committee, and she was really upset about this, as was I. So I wrote a presentation to make at their public hearing. And at the hearing, I made the observation that Sainte-Agathe's function throughout its history was healthcare. That was always its function. Its junction of major roads led to all the local towns, and that removing that vocation from here would be an absolute neglect of our history, of our strengths. Is it a monument today, the Mount Sinai Hospital lot? They were going to do something like that to commemorate it. We might ask, what's the point of commemorating a building that's gone on an empty lot? One of the fascinating things is so many things that we're neglecting in our society because we don't remember. And if we don't remember, we're bound to find ourselves needing things like tuberculosis SANS again. It's still there. It's much worse now than it was then because so many people have been given the antibiotics and developed resistance to them. Now it takes more and more different antibiotics to get rid of it. So eventually it's going to come back. And maybe this site will be used again for that purpose. But whatever, that's a long shot, maybe, but we have to remember, and that's the important thing. We have to remember.